We should, in theory, be live at this point. Because it says, there you go, look, there's a delay, a slight delay. And I'm seeing, there we go, we exist. Haha! Sorry, it's always fun to know whether YouTube is actually going to play ball with us or whether it's going to throw its toys out the pram.
It's been an interesting week, I must say.
Technology has been, how should we say, challenging
Wednesday.
this week. And I see Carol's joined us.
Good evening, Carol, yes.
Good evening.
All right.
Good evening. I'm sure some peeps are going to be joining us. Chime in if you're here. And where the heck are we?
We are on page 6.
Oh my goodness gracious me.
Because there was tons of introduction.
There was tons of introduction and we got, was it the cinemagraph picture? Or was it, did we get to that end of that? We would spend the night sliding backwards, forwards over the borderline of sleep, sometimes actually in the kingdom of dreams, sometimes looking into it more or less consciously and watching it in shadow show like a graphic picture. Something like that.
Right. So are you starting then?
No, that's what I'm saying. That's where we
on
were.
Page 6.
Right.
These dreams were invariably of landscape and seascape, very often of land and seascape combined, which he attributed to his walks over the downs when visiting his wife. And in these scenes, there were never any figures, with one exception. Occasionally, there appeared a cloaked figure in a wide-brimmed hat, which he attributed to an advertisement of Sanderman's Port in colored lights that flickered up and down on a building he had occasion to pass when traveling between his consulting rooms in Wimpole Street and his lodging in Pimlico. Pimlico.
You run it all together. It's a suburb of London. Pimlico.
It was quite simple, quite obvious, and though psychology was merely a sideline with him, the only for differential diagnosis, he had a sufficient working knowledge of its theories to trace one set of symbols to the bungalow sprinkled downs behind the seaside town, and the other to the frequently seen advertisement. He attributed the one to sex repression and a safe guess in the case of most respectable citizens, and a particularly safe one in the case of a professional man placed as he was. The other symbol he attributed to the subconscious desire for the stimulant thus picturesquely advertised.
He's got a taste for port then.
A very understandable desire in an overworked man given to worry. Both desires being repressed without any shadow of compromise. Even Dr. Rupert Annersley Malcolm, neurologist and endocrinologist, could see that they might turn around on him and escape into his dreams. That they might do more than that never entered his head.
That they might do more than that. What are they going to do?
It intrigued his imagination to see the cloaked figure of the dream moving ahead of him in the dusk over the wet London pavement as it had often done through the landscape of sleep. True, he knew it was only a woman in a mackintosh cape, but nevertheless it thrilled him to meet this subconscious fantasy thus exteriorized. The figure moved some 20 yards ahead and kept its distance. Dr. Malcolm put on a spurt in order to come up with it and inspect it more closely. But as he invariably moved as fast as he could, the spurt did not greatly increase the speed or perceptibility, reducing the distance between himself and the figure he was now pursuing.
Isn't that like Rhiannon?
Sounds a bit Rhiannon to me.
Yes, boy, chasing Rhiannon.
For the failure to achieve his intention had, for his cross-grained temperament, turned a passing interest into a determined pursuit. His first impulse was to break into a run, but he knew that such conduct might not escape the notice of the guardians of law and order, and he had no wish to figure in a police court or charge of insulting behavior, where his explanation that he was merely analyzing one of his own dreams was hardly likely to be accepted.
Well, there you go. See? That could be interesting. He therefore pressed on determinedly, heel and toe confident that he could, given time, walk any female down. He was a man who had no use whatever for women, and for whom women, so far as he knew, had likewise no use. This woman, however, continued to keep ahead, and although he was slowly lessening the distance between them, it was clear that even if the traffic lights favoured him, he was unlikely to come up with her unless her walk was very prolonged. Dr. Malcolm found that he was getting the last ounce out of himself that could be done without attracting the attention of the police. As it was, he observed a policewoman looking exactly like Mrs. Noah in her unbecoming uniform, eyeing him with suspicion. Then the thing he greatly feared came upon him. The traffic lights gave the object of his pursuit free passage. Changed before he could come up with them, the released traffic poured over the bridge in a solid mass, and the cloaked figure disappeared into the shadows of the London dusk.
Too many people.
Leaving him with an inexpressible sense of loss, frustration and emptiness. Another 5 minutes at a slightly easier pace took him to his lodgings in Grosvenor Road, chosen for cheapness when he was struggling for a footing in his profession and retained from habit, indifference and lack of incentive to move. In their slovenly comfort, he stripped and had a rub-down, for he had been sweating profusely from his exertions in the mild mugginess of the evening. Then, and only then, did it occur to him to marvel at the pace at which the woman had moved. In bed, later in the evening, he wondered whether the extra fatigue of the long walk home would be sufficient to cause the cloaked figure to appear in the landscape of dream, where he had been wandering almost nightly for the last fortnight. But that night he passed swiftly into a more normal sleep than he had known for many a long day. It was as if all the pent-up ennui of his joyless existence had discharged itself into his fantastic interest in the figure of an unknown woman half seen in the dusk. The term being over, he went down the following day to spend the weekend with his wife, but she, poor soul, having one of her bad turns, definitely did not desire his company, so he was free to take his usual walk over the downs and to prolong it beyond its usual range. He came back to the red brick villa as dusk was falling, tired out, for the walk had been unduly prolonged by the unexpected boon of freedom from an evening meal with his wife and her companion. Sandwiches and a bottle of milk had been left for him beside a banked-up fire in his bedroom, but the sandwiches were dry and curling at the edges, so he drank the milk and left them alone. Then he fell into an uneasy doze in the wicker armchair drawn up beside the fire.
It was not a particularly comfortable chair. Moreover, it creaked with his breathing and disturbed him. But in spite of everything, he realized that the dream that had eluded him all week was about to come. And resisting all temptation to move and so rouse himself, he lay watching the shifting figures on the threshold of sleep forming and dissolving and forming again into more and more definite shapes. At first, they concerned themselves with scraps of everyday life. His landlady, the lavatory cleaner at the hospital, his wife's companion, the elderly maid who was half nurse, half housekeeper. He waited patiently, knowing that it was the usual trick of his mind to disburden itself on the surface impressions before opening the deeper strata. Some lingering remnant of his conscious mind, disciplined by his scientific training, observed that he was seeing a procession of elderly, plain, and itless women.
Itless, tell your friends.
Hey, yeah.
Hey, evening.
Then there appeared a policewoman who he had seen on the embankments, and his hopes rose a bit. But she merely took her place in the procession. Movements on the landing roused him momentarily, and he heard his wife's voice faintly, curiously, coming through her open bedroom door. They were evidently having a bad night. His first instinct was to go in and do what he could, but he knew from past experience that this would merely fuss and upset her. Her own local doctor was competent. He would hear from him what there was amiss, and through him could do whatever he could have done for the unhappy woman who alternated between her bed, her couch, and her wheelchair since her unsuccessful attempt to bring his child into the world.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
The slight disturbance had been sufficient to rouse him temporarily from the torpor induced by the long day in the open. He lit a cigarette and stared into the fire. His mind went back to the night 20 years ago that had changed his vicarious, petite, childlike girl that he'd married into a neurotic, obese, semi-paralyzed invalid. He did not rail against fate. He was long past that. He merely sat with his cigarette smoldering between his tobacco-stained fingers and thought about it. Sounds like a great guy. In fact, he did not blame fate. In an obscure way, he blamed himself, as if he had made some gross error of judgment over a diagnosis. It was true that they had both eagerly desired the child, and that he wrought all the havoc. But that did not seem to make any difference. In the end, the responsibility was his. If it had not been for him, there would have been no child. That was the logic that was inescapable. But it did not do to dwell on what might have been. There was an expansive luxury which exacted its price in days of depression. Only by a rigorous control of mind and imagination could Ephesian
wild beast be managed.
Ephesian. I'm not familiar with that.
It's
some
Greek
sort of
tragedy thing, something or whatever, isn't it? I think.
He had discovered that trick for himself years ago, and it was always a surprise to him that it had never occurred to his colleagues in the psychiatric department.
Well, there you go. To turn his mind away from the dangerous subject, he called up before his imagination a picture of the Thames embankment on a mild, wet winter night. The last of the fallen plane trees' leaves marking patterns on the pavement, and the river running down swift and dark and full of eddies. He lived that incident over again in vivid imagination, going back further and further towards its inception as its savour took hold on him. He could see the scene at the prize giving, the students coming up for their diplomas, coltish and shambling, immature boys entrusted with responsibilities too great to be fairly borne by any human being ever liable to err. He considered their faces and wondered how many of them he would trust to set a mousetrap, let alone the issues of life and death. It was a miscalculation on the part of his own professor of obstetrics that had resulted in the wreck in the next room. He pulled his mind back again and thought of the puzzled face of the little old lady when he had mistaken her for a patient, and the grinning countenance of her son, well aware of certain of the implications of his specialty that called for routine exclusion, and remembered how, his nerve completely gone, the professor of obstetrics had hinted in self-excuse at some such predisposing cause for the disaster his own lack of discretion had precipitated, and he thought with bitterness of the ideals and self-discipline of his youth and young manhood that had served to spare him nothing of either humiliation or self-reproach. Once again he dragged his mind back under control and pictured the river and the embankment and the shadowy, swiftly moving form which, after some tag from a forgotten school of poetry book, he named the becoming fair one, though God knows she hadn't beckoned, and he would have been most indignant if she had. Moreover, it was highly problematical if she was even passably good-looking. He imagined himself walking behind her as he had on that evening, but this time there was no sense of haste and failure, but only the swift, effortless flight of dream. The embankment and its lights faded, and he was out once more in the wild landscape of sleep, colourless as shadowed silver in the light that never was on land or sea.
But there was no vision. She had vanished. Holding himself desperately on the threshold of sleep, he tried consciously to press on into the shadowy landscape, but it eluded him and threatened to turn into a nightmare. Then the spell was broken by the voice of his wife's companion trying to make herself heard on the telephone in the hall, and he was wide awake again. He waited. He heard a car on the drive, steps up the stairs, a murmur of voices in the next bedroom, but he did not stir. Only when he heard the bedroom door open once more and a heavy tread on the landing did he rise, moving quietly as a cat, open his own door and silently beckon his fellow doctor to enter. Then in the dull glow of the dying fire, the two men faced each other, for it had never occurred to Malcolm to turn on the light. The other, however, had known his patient's husband on and off for years and was quite used to the many minor eccentricities of which he was unconsciously guilty.
Oh dear.
He could just see the pale outline of the square, hard-set face in the dimness, with the high line of swept-back hair and the glitter of his keen, pale eyes that he used to think were just like those of a snake getting ready to strike. I guess the doctor likes him, too. The perpetual alertness of the man always seemed to be his outstanding quality, and now, at 2 a.m., in a darkened room, when he had obviously been dozing, he was alert as ever. "Well," said Malcolm, untroubled by the necessity for any of the normal small change of social intercourse. But Dr. Jenkins was used to that. "Nothing serious," he replied. "Nerves mainly, but of course that upheaves the other condition. If you don't mind me saying so frankly, I think it was the prospect of your visit that upset her. As a matter of fact, it happens every time you come. Only it generally doesn't come to a head till after you've gone. If I were you, I should restrict your visits to the bare necessities. Christmas, her birthdays, so on, don't you know?" "I see," said the other curtly. "Very good. I'll do as you say." They took leave of each other, and Dr. Malcolm returned to his chair in the dying fire, wondering why his solution of his monthly purgatory had never been suggested before. Next morning, Mrs. Malcolm was still in a drugged sleep when the time came for him to leave. He had a few words with her companion, his explanations being received with such an air of devout thankfulness that he experienced a sharp pang of conscience as to whether he had always done all in his power to make his visits acceptable. Staring out of the window of the train on his journey back to town, he asked himself, what if he could have done what he had left undone?
Just keep going to the end of the
He
chapter.
honestly didn't think he had done anything in the course of a long years which would reproach himself. Finally he gave up the problem as insoluble, and traveled on to the hospital, where the students scattered before him like a frightened poultry, and a clinical clerk kept dropping his pencil and muddling his papers out of sheer nervousness. The patients fared a little better, but not much, and after an exhausting morning for all concerned, he snatched up a cup of coffee and a sandwich from the buffet at the underground station and went to his rooms in the Wimpole Street, where, with variations, the routine of the morning was repeated. Some doctors boast that their hospital patients get exactly the same treatment as their private patients, but Mr. Rupert Malcolm, without ever thinking about it, treated the patients in his private practice in exactly the same way as his outpatients.
It's nasty to everybody.
He could not possibly do more for their class than he already did, but it was his characteristics, the characteristics of a man, that he did in precisely the same way. The prince had to scramble in and out of his clothes with the same
precipitancy.
I couldn't get that out.
It's a hard
as
one
the
to say.
pauper,
Precipitancy is the
and
pauper.
he extracted the same reluctant admissions from his princes as the charwoman, and the same unmitigated method.
So that was the end of chapter 1, believe it or not.
Well, we'll see
Let's
how
see
far
how
we
we go.
get in chapter 2.
I'll start with chapter 2. So apparently Dr. Malcolm is a bit of an interesting character.
He
He's
sounds like a real shit.
He's like seems to be nasty to everybody, but apparently he's a good doctor, so we'll see. All right, so chapter 2. Such social relaxation as Rupert Malcolm permitted himself consisted in listening or reading papers before learned societies upon his own specialty or its allied subjects. And he invariably cleared out when the learned part of the proceedings was over and the social part began. The relaxation thus obtained was minimal. His brusque, forbidding manner and hard, expressionless face made it improbable, however, that he would have got much more even if he'd stopped on. The long day following his return from the seaside was rounded off by one of the evenings of mutual edification among the learned. Leaving as early as he decently could, he took a taxi back to his rooms and climbed wearily up the 100-odd steps to the top of the house. His present landlady was the niece of his original one, but things went on unchanged. Occasionally she threatened to have his rooms done up, but retreated intimidated before his scowl and contented herself with painting them piecemeal during his absences at the seaside villa. Into this dingy abode with its old-fashioned furnishings, apparently I can't speak either,
No.
these old-fashioned furnishings, he entered without a glance, threw his hat and dispatch case on the table and his overcoat after them, dropped into the worn leather armchair beside the hearth, kicked the banked-up fire into activity with the toe of his shoe, and sat staring at it. It was the first moment since he had quitted the train, taking his unsolved problem with him, that he had any time for thought. He'd been amazed to find that his release from what he had always considered a duty, sternly to be discharged, had cut the very ground from under his feet. All through the long years of the marriage, he was not... All through the long years of the marriage that was not a marriage, he had been supported by the belief that his wife needed his care, and now he found that belief was without foundation. He ought, he knew, to have felt relief, but instead he felt like a lost dog. The man who had spoken the few common-sense words in the firelit room had not the faintest realization of the effect they had on the man who heard them. Not a tone of the voice, not a quiver of the face had betrayed anything. It was the same granite-hard countenance it had always been. Nevertheless, one life had ended, and some means had to be found to enabling another to begin. Rupert Malcolm felt rudderless, anchorless, at the mercy of every wind that blew. His own code of honour still imposed the same inflexible fidelity upon him, but he knew now that all the invalid in the seaside town required of him were the comforts his income so easily provided, and that from the man himself she wanted nothing save to be let alone. Her little dog, her budgerigars, and her faithful companion filled all her emotional needs. When the dog or an occasional budgerigar died, it was replaced, and life, after a brief tearful interlude, went on as usual in the pleasant sunny house overlooking the sea. The sole disturbing influence, himself, had now been removed, and he could picture the two women singing as the evening hymn they always had. Now, thank we all our God.
He's not going to come around anymore.
Isn't that the case?
The uncurtained window irritated him, and he crossed the room and jerked dusty green serge across it.
I guess that would be the curtain.
Ew.
I don't know. It sounds a bit gross, doesn't it? But
His hand on the second curtain, he paused and looked out onto the arc-lit night and the sullen river. Immediately opposite his quarters, across the dark water, a cul-de-sac debouched onto a further embankment, and at its end he could see a thing that he never noticed before: a lit-up facade of a small church. He could see the circular outline of the west window, but whether it held the colored glass of a fanciful religion or a plain glass of a plain one, distance prevented him from discerning. He stood staring at it, the curtain in his hand, wondering what faith it was that conducted its devotion at this hour of the night. Catholic, he supposed. Protestants attend to their religions and duties during an 8-hour day. Staring at the light facade, behind which folk might be presumed to be adoring their creator, he marveled that anyone could see anything in religion. He supposed they must get something out of it, or they wouldn't stick to it, but what that might be was beyond his comprehension. Then, as he watched, the light went out in the distance, and he took a hint and went to bed himself. There, once again, he wandered into the silver-gray country between sleeping and waking, but there was no companion.
Oh dear.
The fact that he now had all his weekends at his own disposal gave Malcolm a vague sense of freedom and relief. Missing his walks on the downs, he thought of going off for a country weekend, but somehow never got started. He did not know where to go or what to do or how to make a beginning, so he just kept relapsing back into his orbit that was narrower than ever. He made an abortive attempt to improve his mind with a modern novel, but soon found it best to let the sleeping dogs lie. He went to the National Gallery, but found himself studying the endocrine balance of the nudes.
Okay.
So on the whole, he decided that he would have to go on as he had always gone, accept life as he found it, and think about it as little as possible. He was still dreaming of landscapes despite the fact that the medical school was closed for the holidays and his work consequently considerably lightened. This worried him a little, for if he were like this now, what would he be like in the new term when it got going in good earnest? It
suddenly occurred to him that the additional fatigue of the teaching and lecturing might serve to bring back the cloaked figure in his dreams, and he found himself looking forward to the beginning of the term with a strange eagerness. He found himself counting the days and realised how much the idea of the woman whose face he had never seen had taken hold of his imagination. It had even begun to console him for the fact that he had cast such poor pearls as he possessed before one who had no conceivable use for them. He discovered that the surest way to put himself to sleep was to set off in imagination for that walk on the embankment with the cloaked woman ahead. He never tried to catch up with her and see her face, dreaded to do so in fact, feeling certain of disillusion. But he felt that in the shadowy cloaked figure he had found a kind of spirit guide through the bewilderments of life. For he was at heart a simple soul, despite his brains. More and more did the fantasy of the cloaked figure grow on him, as night after night, with unfailing regularity, he took the same path into the kingdom of sleep. The path along the Thames embankment, with the leafless plane trees on one hand, and the darkly glittering, hurrying water on the other. And always, sooner or later, the cloaked figure on ahead would appear, and he would follow it with a sense of intense relief into the land of sleep. Presently, he noticed a curious fact. Last thing before getting into bed, he always drew back the curtains from the window to let in the air. And as he looked across the river, he saw that sometimes the facade of the Surreyside church was lit up and sometimes it was not. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason in the hours kept by that denomination. Frequently it would be in action till 1 or 2 in the morning, and upon those occasions he noticed he could never get to sleep till the light across the river was put out. Sometimes, when sleep defied him, he would raise himself in his bed until he could see it out of the window. He would watch and wait, and as soon as the light went out, would settle down on his pillow in expectation, and then, in 20 minutes or so, he would pick up the trail of the figure ahead and press into sleep. And sleep, thus obtained, he discovered, was particularly restful, and sometimes he came back from it with a strange sense of happiness, a sensation to which he had long been a stranger.
More and more as the days went by did he become obsessed by this quest of the cloaked woman. He never desired to catch up with her, but if a night passed and he had not glimpsed her shadowy figure, he was agitated and miserable all the next day. Not until once again the fantasy had ushered in his sleep was restored to peace of mind. But it was more than fantasy. He could picture to himself the embankment in the dusk, with its plain trees and swirling river. But the picture of the shadowy cloaked figure meant nothing. Only when it appeared spontaneously in his fantasy did it afford him any satisfaction. Then, for just so long as he could maintain himself on the threshold of sleep, neither rousing into full wakefulness or sliding off into unconsciousness, did he experience the joy, rising as the time went into ecstasy, of keeping her in sight. At the hospital after such nights they found him rather absent-minded, but much easier to work with. This is very strange.
Isn't it? Slightly odd. I think
Finally, the holidays came to an end, term started again, and he flung himself into his work with a kind of frenzied energy, intent on wearing himself down to the point that when his visions should appear in his dreams, they would be in good earnest. Then, when he was already doing the work of 3 average men, the college went sick, and he took over his private practice for him.
Oh, well.
A colleague.
He's doing 4 people's jobs now.
The days were lengthening, but the extra work kept him so late at the hospital that he never seemed to come home by daylight. He had promised himself that as soon as he was a little less busy, He would walk home every night and so replace his walks on the downs to which he had been accustomed. But somehow he never seemed to have the energy after being on his feet in the wards or the lecture room for hours on end. And so the spring advanced and he never heeded it. Then one day he came out into the hospital quadrangle and saw an evening star, the great Venus, low in the western sky, in the last of the sunset, and a sudden resolution determined him, fatigued though he was, to walk home by the embankment. Someone caught him and delayed him, however. Papers had to be signed in the almoner's office, and by the time he climbed up the steps by the bridge that brought him on the embankment, Venus had disappeared in the evening mist, and the dusk was drawing in.
Oh dear.
He walked as if in a dream. He had pictured that walk so often that he hardly knew whether this particular evening was a fantasy or reality.
Ah. Staring ahead into the gathering dusk, he looked for the shadowy cloaked figure, but she failed to appear. And finally, footsore and disappointed, he turned into his lodgings, dropped into his old armchair, more dead than alive, and then, in the very act of kicking off his shoes, moved by what impulse he knew not, heaved himself wearily out of the frowsy cushions, crossed the room, drew back the curtains, and looked out to see if the facade of the church across the water were lit up. Sure enough it was. That settled it. She never came while they were holding a service, and somehow reassured, he knew not why, he went to bed without bothering about supper, and to sleep without bothering about cloaked women. Towards midnight he woke up, however, and raising himself in bed, looked out to see if the church window was still illuminated. It was, but even as he watched, the light went out. In a short time he saw ahead of him the cloaked figure and entered once more in the land of dreams in her company. Next day, well pleased with his walk on the embankment, he repeated it an earlier hour, and went home with the glory of the sunset over Westminster in his face. And from then on, the walk home beside the river was an unvarying routine, and his health benefited in consequence. He was more serene in his mind also, but he realised how dependent he was upon this nightly vision. Once for a whole week she failed to appear, and he went nearly demented. Nothing would have induced him to consult a colleague, and nothing would have induced him to take a sedative drug of his own prescribing. So he began to be in a bad way.
It sounds like for years he's having visions of this cloaked figure.
And he seems to be strangely obsessed. Then, when he was almost at the end of his tether, there came the dream. The genuine dream of the cloaked figure in the grey landscape. The actual dream that hitherto, despite his efforts to exhaust himself, had never come. So desperate was he in his eagerness, for the first time he pursued the cloaked figure with determination to catch up with it.
Oh, now he's determined.
Over the grey dream landscape he toiled in a kind of nightmare. His feet held at every step as if he were in a bog, his heart beating as if it would burst. Then, as he was almost upon the figure and was just putting out his hand to catch the floating cloak, he woke, bathed in sweat, with the sound of a woman's scream ringing in his ears. He sprang out of bed, flung up the window and put his head out, and even as he did so, he saw the light go on the church over the water. All was quiet in the moonlit roadway, however, and all was quiet in the stuffy house when he leant over the well of the staircase and listened. Little Miss Humphreys, his landlady, he knew would come rushing up to him if anything were wrong, scared of him as she was at normal times. But all was quiet, and he went back to bed again, concluding that the screamer was either dead, delivered, or a phantom of his imagination.
Okay. Next day, he was kept late at the hospital, and though tired after his broken night, his mind was at rest, and so things went better with him. Late as it was, he determined to walk home. It had become a kind of ritual with him, part of his worship, and for no amount of fatigue would he miss it. It was just about the same degree of dusk that it had been upon the occasion of his first embankment walk, and his pilgrimage of faith seemed that evening to have a particular kind of reality about it. As he walked, he wondered what sort of husband he would have made if his marriage had run its normal course. He would have been a difficult one, exacting, tempestuous,
no doubt,
jealous, but he knew that he could have given an intensity of love that the light-hearted little thing he had married would have had no idea what to do with. He realized for the first time that even if catastrophe had not descended on his marriage, it was unlikely to have been an outstanding success, and the realization gave him an extraordinary sense of relief and release. Then, in the very moment of the burden rolling from his shoulders, he saw some 30 yards ahead of him the cloaked figure of a woman, not in fantasy, but in actuality. For a moment he swayed as if drunk, and then pulled himself together, for reality possessed nothing like the same fascination as the fantasy. Mackintosh capes were common among women, and it was highly improbable that this was the original cape wearer who had stared at him off in his dreams. He continued his walk, watching with fairly cynical amusement the cloaked figure on ahead. The reality was, in every way, inferior to the dream. There was nothing that he could see to make a fuss about over the woman in the mackintosh. Then suddenly he realized the pace at which he, and consequently she, were walking. And he knew that it must indeed be the original cape wearer, for few women could hit that gait and keep it up. By a sprint that was almost a run, he shortened the distance between them and was able to observe the manner in which she moved. Accustomed to diagnosing by pit and stance, he learnt much. He saw that she moved all in one piece, gliding over the ground with a movement that ran like a ripple from the ball of the foot to the hip, swinging the folds of the cape from square-held shoulders as rhythmically as a pendulum. He had never seen a human body more perfectly balanced and poised, and forgetting his romance for the moment, he watched that walk with professional interest, assessing the perfect co-coordination of every muscle in the rhythmically moving body. Her figure and build he could not judge, for the folds of the cloak hid it all, but that gait he would never forget as long as he lived. A mad idea enters his head of hastening after the woman and accosting her, but that was instantly dismissed. Apart from the inadvisability of such proceedings for a professional man of standing, he was, and always had been, as shy as a schoolboy behind his brisk exterior. So he strode on till the traffic lights again played him a scurvy trick, and he lost her once more.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. We're spending a lot of time chasing this woman, aren't we?
Yeah, a whole chapter and a half.
Well, yes, nearly 2 chapters so far. He raced up the stairs to to his room, flung back the curtains, stared across the river, and even he did so, the lights went on in the dark facade of the church over the water. I wonder how long before he goes to that church.
That's a while. I've read this before.
Oh, you've read this before? Doesn't it needs
like
to
30 years ago.
It needs to get a bit of a move on here.
I don't remember much because I read it like 30 years ago.
I think we can be cutting to the chase, perhaps.
No,
anyway,
it takes a while.
We are chasing, but we're not catching. He raced up the stairs to his room, flung back the curtains, stared across the river, and even as he did so, the lights went on in the dark facade of the church over the water. Sometime, he told himself, when he was less busy, he would cross by the neighbouring bridge and have a look at that church. See, I told you he was going to do that. And see what denomination worshipped so capriciously. But it was some time before he was less busy, and he was so busy, in fact, that he had temporarily and reluctantly to abandon his embankment walks. But his vision still served the purpose of putting him off to sleep each night with unfailing regularity. He did not have to visualise her now, for as soon as he put his head on the pillow, she came of her own accord. There had been a meeting of the governors of the hospital, of which he was one, and it had not been altogether peaceful. A complaint had been made in influential quarters about his manners and methods, and the matter had been raised as tactfully as possible, it is true, but it still had been raised. And just when his wife's doctor had bidden him to remove his unwanted presence, so now he was startled, bewildered and humiliated to find that he had been upsetting people and making himself generally detested. The council, who had been dreading the ordeal of belying their formidable cat, were amazed to find him begging to be told what he had done wrong. This so took the wind out of their sails that they ended by assuring that he had done nothing wrong, and generally smoothing him down and soothing him, and then sat back and stared at each other in amazement after he'd taken his usual precipitate departure. It was foggy when he came out into the hospital quadrangle in the dusk, but that did not did not alter his decision to walk home. Nothing he felt could soothe and console him so effectually as the imagined presence of his fair one. When a man had given his best for a quarter of a century and is suddenly told that his best is not good enough, he is apt to feel as if the world were falling about his ears. But what did he do that upset people? It was true he had never cultivated the social side of hospital life, but he had generally done his job to the best of his ability. He tried to console himself with the memory of his outstanding successes, and there were many. Patients rescued from a living death whom everyone else had abandoned as hopeless. Surely that counted for something, but apparently not. Hurt, bewildered, his self-confidence shaken to its foundations, he walked more slowly than was his wont, and as he walked, he saw, as if in a dream, the cloaked woman overtake and pass him. What? She overtook him.
For a moment, his heart seems to stop, and then it began to hammer at his ribs. She was only a dozen feet ahead instead of the usual 20 or 30 yards, and even in the thickening fog could not escape him. He followed her, drawing as close as he dared, and at the first check at the traffic lights, he was at her elbow. A heavy fur around her shoulders and a wide-brimmed slouch hat prevented him from seeing her face, but he had a thrilling sense of being in her atmosphere and felt himself beginning to tremble. He crossed the road, almost at her side, and then judged it advisable to drop back a little, lest she become aware of his presence and resent it. So they went, one behind the other, past the Savoy and the Temple and Westminster, and then at the old stone bridge she turned across the river. For a moment the man hesitated. Even in the fog there had been enough walkers on the embankment pavement to make his presence inconspicuous. But it was unlikely that even in the fog he could follow her over the Lambeth Bridge without her becoming aware of it. However, he was determined to risk it. There was nothing in his conduct she could complain of, even if she realized he had followed her from Blackfriars Bridge.
Blackfriars.
Blackfriars?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a real bridge.
Okay. His shoes had rubber heels, and he could move quietly for all his stocky build, and determined to chance his luck. The fog grew thicker and thicker as they got out onto the center of the river, and with a sudden pang, he realized that he was acting like a cad. He would frighten the life out of the woman if she detected his presence. Here was he doing the very thing which they had blamed him at the hospital, and to the last person in the world he wished to alarm. But she kept on her way without turning, and the center of the river was already overpassed. In a few minutes he heard the sound of her footstep change as she left the hollow pavement of the bridge for the Surreyside embankment, and realized how close he had drawn to her in the fog, when almost simultaneously he felt the roadway under his own feet. The fog was thicker here, much thicker, and he had to follow her closely, but there were more people about, and his presence passed apparently unnoticed. At any rate, she never looked around. She crossed the road, the man dropping back a little for safety's sake, and then, after an anguished moment, when he thought he had lost her, getting close to her heels again, closer than he had dared to before. Then, throwing him into complete confusion, she stopped so abruptly that he nearly trod on her heels, and saw that she was about to enter the church.
I knew she was going there.
She paused for a moment, fumbling for the latch in the darkness, and then the door yielded. Hardly knowing what he did, he snatched his opportunity. If she were attending a service, why shouldn't he? He laid his arm on the door, and she turned to close it and pass through, shutting it behind him, to find pitch darkness, perfect silence. The church, if it was a church, was empty.
Dun, dun, dun. I knew she was going to go to the church.
Well, yeah.
The man stood thunderstruck, realizing his predicament, realizing only too clearly how his behaviour must appear to the woman who had been following. Struggling in vain to find words to reassure her, for she must be scared to death by his behaviour. Struggling in vain to find words to explain himself. For if she turned him over to the police, as she had every right to do, he was going to find himself in an exceedingly unpleasant position, with his reputation lost beyond redemption. It seemed to him that professional ruin stared him in the face. He felt cold all down his spine at the enormity of his offence. Stepping back, he groped for the door by which he had entered, but his hand ran along panelling. Swinging around, he stood awaiting developments, involuntarily clutching a fist. And then, leaving him in doubt no longer, the beam of an electric torch shone on his face. "What is it you want?" asked a calm, level voice. The man gave a gasp of release. I thought it was a church and I came in for the service," he stammered. "It's not a church any longer. It's a private house," came the calm voice. "The door is behind you if you care to go." He turned, and she shone the beam of a torch onto the knob of the Yale lock. Thankfully he grasped it, and the door swung open. Then, on the very threshold of deliverance, he again turned and paused, unable to resist the attraction she had for him. But the light shone full on his face, blinding him. She would know him again, but he had not a single glimpse of her. He hesitated for a moment, but she kept the beam of her torch steadily in his eyes, and knowing that all the cards were stacked against him and that explanations were as undesirable as they were impossible, he hastily clapped his hat on his head and stumbled out into the fog that seemed to have suddenly thickened into an impenetrable mask of flocculent murk. By some fluke of luck, he heard a taxi discharging its load a few doors down the street, and hurrying towards it, he bade its driver to get him home as best he might. Eventually it did get him home, but the route was a circuitous one and took time. Long before he arrived at his own door, Dr. Malcolm had ample opportunity to realise the kind of hot water he was liable to get himself into if he went on like this. And what with the telling off he had at the hospital, and the realisation of the kind of fool and also the kind of cad he had made of himself, his stock stood very low in his own estimation when he let himself into his dreary rooms and found little enough there to put heart into him.
A friendless and unsociable man, without hobbies or any interests outside of his work. If anything succeeded in penetrating through the epidermis with which he had encased himself, it got him very badly on the raw, for there was nothing to mitigate. No friend with whom he could talk things over, nothing with which he could distract his mind, and moreover a man of his deadly earnestness.
That's a hard one to say. Earnestness.
And cast-iron sense of duty was capable of laughing at his own foibles. The sole consolation life held for him was the dream woman, who had just shone an electric torch in his eyes till she blinded him and gave him a very broad hint that if he did not take himself off, he would be handed over to the police. He knew only too well the motive of the kind of elderly satire that pesters decent woman, and probably so did she. If she were any sort of woman of the world, as her calmness and unpleasant situation indicated, how was he to explain to her that he wasn't that kind of brute? He couldn't explain anything to her. All he could do was leave her alone. He must sacrifice his dream along with all the other sacrifices that life had demanded of him, and stick rigidly to the one thing he knew, the one thing he could do, his professional work. The minute he left that narrow path, he was in trouble. He walked over to the window and put back the curtain. In some way he associated the cloaked woman with the lighted church. Why, he had never been able to imagine, save that he could only find her when the light was extinguished in the church across on the water. He stared out into the blackness of the foggy night, but even the slight consolation of seeing a familiar light was denied him. The fog smothered everything, and only a faint glow of the nearer lamp was visible. Then suddenly an idea leapt into his mind.
Oh no.
The woman he had followed and crossed the river and entered the church on the Surrey side. She had said that it was no longer used as a church, but had become a private house. Was it by any chance possible that the lit facade he had so often gazed at was her actual dwelling place?
Well, very probably.
Allowing for the curve in the river and the way he had turned after crossing the bridge, it appeared quite possible. The capricious hours of the lighting and the darkening of the window would then be explained.
We can carry on a bit longer, I guess.
Well,
Dr. Malcolm leant his elbows on the ledge of the window and tried to penetrate the impenetrable darkness by sheer concentration. He was a man accustomed to intense concentration. When at work, it could easily have happened to him, as Isaac Newton, that his papers had caught fire without his noticing it. He was also a man with a vivid pictorial imagination, who could draw without reference to books or specimens any ramification of the nervous system and its anatomical background. Despite the fog, he could see the lit-up facade of the church across the water as clearly as if he stood in front of it. He could see its door, the pointed, iron-studded door of a conventional modern Gothic. He could feel the coal-fogged dew iron of the heavy latch under his hand. He could feel the warm air of his face as he entered on the heels of the cloaked woman. But instead of the painful debacle of actuality, he found himself not in a church, but in a lofty and beautiful room with a large open fireplace, where a fire of logs was burning. For 1 second he perceived it as if he actually saw it with his physical eyes, and then it vanished. And he turned away from the window, letting the curtain fall back against the gloom outside. He knew it was merely a trick of the imagination, a curious, involuntary feat of fantasy in which his rational mind had no part. But it wiped out the unpleasant taste left behind by his sordid adventure, and left him not merely at peace, but curiously uplifted. He knew perfectly well that according to all the accepted canons of psychiatry, he was playing dangerous tricks with his mind. Nevertheless, each contact left him calmer and happier than he had been for many a long day. He dropped into the warm leather armchair beside the fire and tried to consider the situation as objectively as he could. He had obviously built up a fantasy around the figure of a woman seen 2 or 3 times in the dusk. There was nothing out of the way in that. Plenty of imaginative men did that sort of thing. He had done it himself as a young fellow before his marriage. Once he'd become engaged to Eva, he had rigidly cut it out, and rather than had limited his imaginations to her face and form, and then only within the strictest limits of propriety. He did not think he had, even in imagination, ever let himself go where women were concerned. He had made up for it, however, by some magnificent scientific battles, and was not averse to personal ramparts with anyone who was disposed to show fight. I think we can make the end of the chapter.
I think we will, yeah. And then that'll be it.
Mm-hmm.
He saw, however, that he was within measurable distance of breaking his own rule, for although his feeling was idealized to the verge of tenuity, it was nonetheless a surprisingly strong feeling, and not one that ought to be harbored by a married man. And when it led him into following a flesh-and-blood woman for miles through the London streets, forcing his way into her house and generally making an unmitigated nuisance of himself, even if no stronger term were applicable, it was decidedly not a feeling that a professional man, with any regard for his career, was wise to give way to.
Indeed.
The dream must be cut out, and that was that. He had nipped complications in the bud before, and they had died stubborn and given no trouble. There had been a nurse once at the hospital, a woman medical student at one of the clinics, and the thing of which he was not ashamed, one of Miss Humphrey's little maids. The 2 former had never, he was certain, had any suspicions of his feelings that had aroused him. The third, a little wretch, had deliberately set herself to arouse those feelings, and to his eternal shame and amazement had succeeded with the greatest ease.
Oh dear.
But the moment he realized what was happening, he had stalked down to Miss Humphreys in her underground den and said straight out, "That girl goes or I do," and she goes now," and handed the startled and indignant landlady a necessary month's wages.
Wow.
But cutting out his new obsession was going to be an entirely different matter. He had enjoyed her companionship for several months, had in fact sedulously cultivated her. A fantasy though she was, she had wrapped herself round the very roots of his being. But he had trained himself, like Napoleon, to close the drawers of his mind, one pigeonholed subject, and slammed this one shut resolutely. Rang for a supper, got out the papers relevant to an address he was preparing, and when the supper arrived, ate it with one hand and wrote his notes with the other, thus allowing no scope for the wild beasts of Ephesus again. Okay.
Whoever these wild beasts are.
All right. He worked late, but when he went to throw open the window before going to get into bed, he saw through the clearing fog that the church across the water was still lit up. He turned away, trying to put the whole business out of his head by recalling certain points in his paper. But even as he switched off the bedside lamp, he knew that he had not much chance of getting sleep, as he was flying to the moon. He had a heavy day ahead of him, and a presidential address to give in the evening. The prospect was not pleasant. He lay flat on his back, arms across his face, trying to get his mind under control, but it was no use. The Ephesian beasts were out of their cages.
Oh dear.
He got out of bed and went across in his thin pajama suit to the wide open window where the last of the fog was blowing calmly into the room. Involuntarily, he looked across the river. The light was out in the church at the Surrey side. If he yielded to the temptation, he could get his lady any time he wanted her. He turned back to the bed again and sat down on its edge, elbows on knees, head in hands, and groaned aloud. Surely she was better than the beasts of Ephesus. I don't know who that is, but anyway. But that was nonsense. Just sophistry. It was only a matter of time before she ended at Ephesus. He had got enough sense to know that. The only thing to do was to cut the whole thing out. Cut it out. Cut it out. Then suddenly, through the fingers that pressed against his eyeballs, he saw the cloaked woman, face to face. She stood in his room before him. She spoke. "Do not be disturbed. All is well." He lifted his head from his hands, giddy, sweating, shaking. But she was no longer there. She had gone just as she'd come. Do you want to read the last
No,
one?
you
Okay.
might as well finish at this point.
He
Go
was
for it.
trembling all over like a frightened horse. He could feel the sweat trickling down his chest, and his thin pajama jacket was sticking to his back. He had too much sense of risk pneumonia, and rolled into bed and lay there panting. Then there came to him as he grew warm between the blankets, the most extraordinary sense of peace and relaxation, muscle by muscle. The overwrought man slacked off. He turned over onto his side, almost asleep as he did so, and it seemed to him, from the configuration of his pillows, that his head lay on a woman's shoulder.
My goodness, and we're up to chapter 3 next time. Look at that. That was pretty good going. Well, apparently he's quite obsessed with this. And then we move into the Moon
It's
Mistress.
just so weird.
This is interesting. Well, more on this next week.
Same bad time.
Same bad
no,
time.
Actually,
Well,
that's not true. We'll be back to Magical Mondays.
Well, we should be.
And Book Club Monday.
Although this Monday coming, I have an appointment, so Magical Monday is going
We
to
don't know
be
what
at
we're
a
gonna
different
do.
time. We'll
We're
figure
just
it
having
out.
all kinds of fun.
We'll figure it out. It's just interesting times. But thank you so
anyway,
much for
thank
watching.
you for hanging in there.
Yes, and if you're joining us late or at a later time, thank you for joining us at a later time. It's an interesting book, as you will see. All right, thank you so much. We're off to make some din,
Peace.
and we'll bid you an awfully pleasant evening.